연자는 닥터 엘리자베스 웨이저십니다.
Thank you very much, and it's a very big pleasure to be here at this excellent meeting, which I'm really enjoying in Seoul. So, I want to talk about the role of academic societies, publishers, and journal editors in promoting ethical publication practices. Start by thinking, what do we mean by publication ethics? I think publication ethics are simply part of research ethics. It's really a spectrum. It's false to try and divide and say there is a clear line, and here research ethics ends and publication ethics begins, because many of the things are linked. And you can see that through the life cycle of a piece of research, you move from left to right on this diagram. You start with things that perhaps might be considered to be purely research ethics, such as the conduct of the research, the protection of research participants. And you move through, on the right-hand side, to things that you might consider are solely publication ethics, such as selective publication, redundant publication. But in the middle, you have a very grey area where I would argue that it's not very constructive to try to worry about whether it's research ethics or publication ethics. It's all ethics. Many forms of misconduct only cause harm when they are published. So if fabricated data stay on the researcher's laptop, they don't do any harm. If you choose to plagiarize something but you don't publish it, it's not really plagiarism. So many forms of research misconduct actually only get revealed or only occur in publication. And examples, I would argue, are plagiarism, fabrication, falsification, problems with authorship attribution, and redundant publication. So we've been talking a lot about researchers. Who can commit misconduct? Here, perhaps there is a difference between publication ethics and research ethics in that more people are involved. So, of course, we often focus on misconduct by authors, such as plagiarism. But there can also be misconduct by journal editors. If they abuse their position, if they are unfair and don't treat authors correctly, if, for example, they favour work by their friends or relatives or people from their own university and discriminate against other people who they feel are in competition. You can also have misconduct by peer reviewers, such as the theft of ideas or data from an unpublished manuscript. And then there are the either commercial or non-commercial, but the owners of the journals, the academic societies or the publishers, who may have their own agendas, who may actually bias the process in order to favour that agenda and try and have an influence on the journal editors and not respect the principle of academic freedom. And I would argue that any of those categories of people can commit misconduct. In thinking about what one might do about these types of misconduct, I think it's helpful just to think about when they occur in the research cycle. So again, I've got this diagram where we go from left to right, starting with the sort of the early phase of the research and going right through to the reporting, and thinking about who is involved and when does it occur. And of course, you get the transition. People start out as researchers and they turn into authors. But then you also get the other people involved, the peer reviewers, the editors, and the publishers tending to be involved at a rather later stage. I think it's also helpful to think in terms of who might have influence, who might prevent the misconduct, who might detect the misconduct. So with the early stages, when you're talking about the IRB approval, for example, about protection of participants, then I think the role is very much that of the institution. There may also be guidelines. The journals probably don't get involved until the later stage, although I've put an arrow here because their instructions and their policies may, of course, influence researchers at an earlier stage, but it isn't until you get published, usually, that you start to look at the journal instructions. And then again, you may have the academic societies and the publishers, and their guidelines may also have some effects at the earlier stages of research, but will probably mostly come into play later on. So, who is responsible? I liked the Singapore statement very much because it did emphasize the role both of the individual and the institution. I thought the speaker yesterday, or actually I think it was someone who raised a question, who asked, was the Huang case, was it a national problem, an institutional problem, or a personal problem? I thought that was an excellent question, and my answer is, it's all of those. And I think one of the reasons, oh, is this still working? Yeah, I think one of the reasons why research integrity is so difficult is it's very easy to say it's somebody else's fault. And we all have to think about the responsibility for the research integrity in different organizations. So I would say that institutions, researchers, and societies, and publishers, and journals all have responsibilities. However, although they all can take responsibility, I think they do have important differences in the roles that they may play. Some of the important factors that may discourage misconduct are education, training, providing information, promoting good practice, which of course means having a policy to define what good practice is, detecting misconduct and hoping that that will deter also future misconduct, investigating cases, punishing, and you might see that role as preventing future misconduct, and finally, correcting the literature. And I would argue that the different institutions involved have different emphasis in the roles that they play. So you will see here, this is just my sort of schema of the different roles of the different organizations. They have both different opportunities and different responsibilities. So all may play a part in education. Journals educate their authors, institutions, of course, educate their students, and academic societies. So when I say society, I don't mean society at large, I mean academic societies have a role in educating their members. They may all promote good practice. Journals, in particular, may detect misconduct. I think the role of journals is particularly important because editors are often the first people to see and come across the evidence of misconduct. However, when you get to investigation, I believe that it's only the institution who ought to be involved in that. The journal editors do not have a legal standing, they don't have the training, they don't have the resources to conduct a proper investigation into research misconduct. And then in terms of prevention, all may be involved. And then here a difference in emphasis that I think the journal has a particular responsibility for correcting the literature if they have published anything affected by misconduct. I was involved when I was the chair of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. I was involved in developing these guidelines on cooperation between research institutions and journals. And we started by defining the different responsibilities of these two. So the guidelines state, journals are responsible for the conduct of their editors, for safeguarding the research record, and for ensuring the reliability of everything they publish. On the other hand, institutions are responsible for the conduct of their researchers and for encouraging a healthy research environment. Let's think about those categories that I described, the education, promotion, prevention, and think of the different activities that all these organizations can take part in. So, policies at institutional, journal, society, and publisher level can be very helpful to define good conduct, to define misconduct, to tell authors and researchers what is expected of them. Training courses, we've been hearing a lot this morning about responsible conduct of research and of IRB training, for example. All the people involved, I think, need training. And one of the problems can often be that journal editors, although they have a lot of responsibility, very often lack specific training in how to be an editor and in publication ethics. Mentoring and informal opportunities for education are very important. Journal instructions to authors and guidelines as well. Then in terms of promotion, and this is actually an old printing press, in case you were wondering. Came out looking a bit like a guillotine, which was not the plan, but I was actually thinking about spreading the literature. So raising awareness, producing a laboratory handbook or an institution handbook or guideline. Journal and institution websites can give a lot of information about responsible conduct of research and research integrity. Newsletters from societies and institutions. The journal submission systems themselves, I think, need careful attention because they can both educate authors and prevent certain forms of misconduct, particularly in terms of things like, has this research been published before? Have all the people who qualify as authors been listed as authors? Have all the authors actually approved the final version? Some journals now automatically send an email to all authors, and they say that it's surprising how often someone will email back and say, I had no idea my name was on this paper. So there are certain simple steps they can take which may reduce publication misconduct. Then the detection. And outside we have people talking about different methods of text matching software and anti-plagiarism screening. And I think this has been a huge advance. It's a really helpful tool that many journals are now using to detect both plagiarism and redundant publication. So the text matching software is very widely used. In those disciplines where digital images are very important and form a really core part of the data, then image manipulation screening is also important. It's less automated, it involves more expertise, and it's therefore more expensive to do, but I think it is important. And then, of course, the role of whistleblowers. Often it's readers or people working in the laboratory who act as whistleblowers who then alert either the institution or the journal. So it's very important that they are protected and that they feel safe in doing that. Then you get to the process of investigation, which, as I say, I believe and COPE recommends should be the responsibility of the academic institution, of the researcher's employer. It should not be the role of the journal editor. And for an investigation to be done properly, you need due process, it needs to be fair, you need at certain stages confidentiality, at other stages the need to know and the need to disclose what has happened. And I would argue very strongly you do need liaison between the journal and the institution. But here I think problems often arise because of concerns about confidentiality, concerns about human resources, employment legislation, and so on, and the different role between the employer and the institution and the journal. And that can sometimes cause conflict. In terms of prevention, we think sometimes of sanctions and punishments. And one of the key clauses, I think, of the COPE guidelines is it says that retraction, these are the guidelines on retraction, says the key purpose of retraction is to correct the literature. It's not to punish the authors. And I think we need to separate out the sanctions and preventive measures from the measures designed to correct the literature. And then finally we come to correction, and I love this image, which to my mind is cleansing the literature, the lady with her feather duster in the library, but also perhaps the element of punishment. So I've got this image here as well. Corrections, retractions, expressions of concern, which were another set of guidelines that I developed when I was at COPE, an area that does cause difficulty, an area that we know some journals don't behave well on. Several people have mentioned the Perlman case, and we know that actually of the 9 or 10 papers listed by the ORI, in fact 3 of those remain unretracted. They have not been properly labelled or retracted, so you could go and find them and have no idea that that actually contains fabricated data. So we know that journals don't always do this well. We also know that sometimes institutions are reluctant to share enough information which would enable the journals to do a good job and actually retract the literature correctly. So, policies, I think, are very important, and I think the aspects of publication ethics that they ought to cover are authorship, conflicts of interest, record keeping and data storage, handling misconduct, investigations, sanctions, and definitions of the different forms of misconduct, such as plagiarism, image manipulation, and redundant publication. For journals, I think retractions are very important, and of course authors need to know what would happen if their work was retracted as well, and then the importance of whistleblower protection. I've mentioned policies in general. Who needs these policies? Well, The main themes that I've been talking about, the academic research institutions, the academic societies, the journals, the publishers, and also I would introduce a new category, the funders. Research funders are hugely influential. If you want to get funding, you are prepared to jump through a whole lot of hoops and do whatever the funder asks you. And I therefore would really encourage funders to consider that important power that they have and to encourage researchers to behave responsibly and to really think about what their policies are. For example, in the world of medicine, there is concern about the non-publication of negative findings. So if you do a study, doesn't come up with the answer you want, you are more likely not to publish it. And that can actually bias the literature and cause guidelines to be incorrect because we only hear the good news, particularly about new products and new drugs, and we never hear the bad news. Funders can actually be very influential on this, and some funders are now actually withholding the last part of the grant until the data are published. And that's another example of a mechanism that could encourage complete publication. I haven't mentioned the research ethics committees and the IRBs. I actually think they have a potential also for looking into correct publication practices. Certainly in Europe, they have not embraced that, and they have said, no, that's not our job, we don't have the resources to do that, and I appreciate it. But they are in a great position because they know all the studies that have got approved, they require a report at the end of the study, but they don't seem to think it's their responsibility to make sure that study is properly published. I would argue that the research is not complete and not ethically done unless it is properly published, and I would really like to see the IRBs and the research ethics committees taking that responsibility on, but I know they are unwilling to. If we have all these different policies from these various different organizations, is there a risk that they ask people to do conflicting things? Well, of course, the policies need to be consistent. And so I had my image of the Russian dolls here, which all fit neatly into each other. And you don't have one that has something sticking out that prevents it from matching up. So whether your policy is a small policy focusing on a particular narrow area or a broader policy covering a wider range, it should be consistent with the others so that we don't ask researchers to do impossible things and one policy asks them to do this and then the other policy forbids it. So it is again important, I think, that the journals, the academic societies and the institutions talk to each other. We should also think about the indirect effects that the things such as the appointment and promotion systems may have. There may be strange incentives that may actually create an environment in which research misconduct and publication misconduct in particular is more likely. So, for example, if we put great emphasis on the speed of publication, or on the number of publications that someone must have, or on the fact that they must be the first author on a number of publications, those are, I'm afraid, big incentives for redundant publication, perhaps for plagiarism, perhaps even for falsification and fabrication. And I do think that institutions and funders need to think about the way they measure the quality and the output of researchers when they're deciding on grants or deciding on appointments and tenure, because those certainly can have big effects on the incentives and the environment, and those are likely to affect researcher behavior. So I would argue there's a strong need for communication. That's why we needed these guidelines on cooperation between research institutions and journals on research integrity cases. And I would encourage you to look at those. We had a very interesting discussion in Montreal at the 3rd World Congress on Research Integrity, and we're planning to have another session in Rio next year to take these further, because I really think this will only develop with dialogue. We're beginning to understand the challenges faced by institutions and the challenges faced by journals. They are different and they have different responsibilities, but unless we understand the respective responsibilities and the things that they're both facing and understand what they can and can't do, I don't think we will make progress. The challenges include things like, although a journal should not be investigating, they should not be judging whether misconduct has occurred, they obviously need to collate evidence. So before they approach an institution, they need to gather the evidence together. Well, how much evidence should they gather? And if the journal editor keeps asking the author, please send your raw data, send us these files, do this, do that, is there a risk that they might actually jeopardize an institutional investigation? Is there a risk, for example, that the author might destroy evidence? Is there a risk also that they might simply withdraw their article from the journal, alter it so that they covered up the misconduct and submitted it to another journal? So that is always a dilemma. Journal editors are sometimes reluctant to contact institutions as well, particularly, I think, if they are in different countries or different continents where they're not familiar with what the system is. They don't know how the authors will be treated. They don't really know how fair the process will be. They might have concerns that authors will be unfairly treated. So they don't want to spark a major investigation over something that was perhaps disproportionate, a small problem. It's also difficult to know what information should be shared about cases of research misconduct. We've heard several speakers say that there are big problems that we don't share enough between institutions, and I would argue that also we don't share enough between journals and institutions. For a journal to issue a retraction notice that states clearly whether it has been due to misconduct or due to honest error, which I think is hugely important, because unless we label the retractions clearly, we risk labeling the honest researchers who come forward after an honest mistake as if they had committed misconduct, which of course is the opposite of the case. They have actually been very brave. If someone says to the editor, I realize I had a problem, cell line was contaminated, or the calculations were wrong, that is actually a very brave and very admirable thing to do. And we definitely want to distinguish an article that is retracted for that reason from an article that is retracted because of fraud or fabrication or plagiarism. So it's very important that the retraction notice in the journal is clear. But in order to be clear, the editor needs to know the result of a misconduct investigation at an institution. And all too often, the institutions say, I'm sorry, I can't tell you, it's confidential. And that puts the editors in a very difficult position. Similarly, the peer review process is normally completely confidential. Editors do not share the names of their peer reviewers, they do not share the review accounts. But when might it be useful to share those with an institution? If, for example, there was an allegation that a peer reviewer had misbehaved and had stolen data or text from a manuscript. So there are these issues of confidentiality, about sharing of information. There are also, I think, concerns, as I mentioned, about the human resources protection, about employers' responsibilities and so on, which make this a really potentially difficult area. So, my conclusions. I believe that research institutions, academic societies, research funders, journal editors and publishers, be they commercial companies or academic societies, all have responsibilities for promoting ethical research and publication practices. They need to have policies that are clear to researchers and are consistent, and therefore cooperation between these different groups is essential. And I'll finish with a quotation from perhaps the Americans in the audience would say quite an unusual source. J.C. Penney, the creator of the J.C. Penney chain of shops, which will be familiar to anybody from North America, and he said, "Honor bespeaks worth, confidence begets trust, service brings satisfaction, and cooperation proves the quality of leadership." And it's that last part I think we should focus on, that the good leaders in both institutions and journals, a sign of the strength of the leadership, should be not keeping things to themselves, but cooperating with each other. Thank you very much.